So here's the thing about meat in 1875. If you wanted beef in New York City, somebody had to walk a living, breathing 1,000-pound steer onto a rail car in Chicago, ship it east for 3 days while it lost weight, got bruised, sometimes died, then slaughter it in a Manhattan stockyard where the whole neighborhood smelled like blood and death. And everyone, ranchers, railroads, butchers, thought this was just how it worked, the only way. Except there was this one guy, Gustavus Franklin Swift, standing in a Chicago slaughterhouse in 1875, watching another trainload of cattle head east, and he's doing math in his head that nobody else is doing. Every steer that walks onto that train weighs maybe 1,200 pounds live weight, but only about 600 pounds of that is actual beef you can sell. The rest? Bones, hide, organs, waste. So the railroads are charging Swift to ship 1,200 pounds, but he's only selling 600 pounds on the other end. He turns to his partner and says something like, "What if we killed them here and just shipped the meat?" And his partner probably looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. Because here's what everyone knew in 1875. Fresh meat spoils. In summer heat, beef goes bad in hours. Even in winter, you've got maybe 2 days before it starts turning. And the trip from Chicago to New York City takes 3 days minimum, sometimes 4 if there are delays. So the entire industry, billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, the whole system of feeding American cities was built around one simple reality. You cannot ship dead meat long distance. Gustavus Franklin Swift was 46 years old, and he'd already made a comfortable living as a butcher and cattle dealer. He wasn't some crazy inventor or wild-eyed dreamer. He was a practical New England businessman who'd started at 14 buying a heifer with $19 he'd saved, slaughtering it, selling the meat. Worked his way up sheer through relentless focus. He knew meat, knew cattle, knew the business cold. But he also knew the math didn't work. See, Swift had moved to Chicago in 1875 specifically because that's where the cattle industry lived. After the Civil War, railroads connected the Great Plains ranches to Chicago's Union stockyards, which by 1875 was processing 2 million head of cattle a year. The city had become the meat capital of America, maybe the world. But all that meat still had to reach the cities where people actually lived: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And the system was brutally inefficient. The railroads loved it, of course. They charged by weight and distance, and live cattle weighed twice what dressed beef weighed. The local butchers in every city loved it too, because they got to do the slaughtering and sell the organs and bones and hide locally. Even the cattle dealers loved it, because the system required dealers in both Chicago and in the destination cities. But Swift saw what nobody else seemed to see. Or maybe they saw it but couldn't figure out how to change it. If you could ship dressed beef instead of live cattle, you'd cut shipping costs in half. You'd reduce waste, you'd deliver better quality meat because the animal wouldn't be stressed and bruised from 3 days on a train. You could slaughter cattle year-round in Chicago where labor was cheap instead of dealing with seasonal variations and expensive urban labor. The only problem, and it was a pretty big problem, was that beef spoils. Now, ice had been used for food preservation for decades. The ancient Romans stored ice in underground chambers. By the 1850s, there was a whole ice harvesting industry in the northern states, cutting blocks from frozen lakes, storing them in insulated warehouses, shipping them south. Rich people had ice boxes in their homes. Hotels kept ice. But nobody had figured out how to keep meat cold on a moving railroad car for 3 or 4 days. A few people had tried. There were experimental refrigerator cars before Swift, but they didn't work well. The early designs just packed ice around the meat, but ice melts, water drips on the beef, the meat gets soggy and discolored, customers won't buy it. Plus, the ice at the top melts first, so the warm air rises and the whole refrigeration system fights itself. Swift needed something better. He needed a system that would keep meat cold without touching it. He needed air circulation. He needed drainage for melted ice. He needed a design that could survive the rough handling of railroad operations, the constant starting and stopping, the temperature swings between Chicago winters and summer heat. And he needed it to be cheap enough that the savings on shipping costs would actually matter. So Swift did what good engineers do when they don't know how to build something. He found someone who did. Andrew Chancey was a railroad engineer from Detroit with experience in ventilation systems and refrigeration concepts. The two of them started sketching designs in late 1877. But here's where it gets interesting, because even before they built a single working car, Swift was already facing opposition, serious opposition. The railroads didn't want refrigerated beef cars. They made more money shipping live cattle. Simple as that. When Swift approached them about running refrigerated cars on regular freight schedules, they quoted him rates that made the whole idea unprofitable. Some railroad executives told him flat out they wouldn't carry his cars at any price. The local butchers in eastern cities definitely didn't want Chicago beef. They had good businesses slaughtering local cattle, and they told their customers that Western beef was inferior, unwholesome, even dangerous. They lobbied city governments to ban the sale of meat slaughtered more than 24 hours earlier. And the established cattle dealers, the guys who'd been shipping live animals for decades, they really didn't want some upstart changing the whole system. They had relationships with the railroads, with the stockyards, with the buyers. They spread rumors that Swift was trying to monopolize the meat industry, that his refrigerated beef would poison people. So there's Swift, in 1878, 49 years old, betting everything on a system that hasn't been proven, facing opposition from the railroads who controlled transportation, the butchers who controlled retail sales, and the dealers who controlled the existing supply chain. He could have stopped, could have stayed a successful cattle dealer, made a comfortable living, retired rich. Instead, he built the car anyway.
The first refrigerated car that Chase and Swift built in 1878 was, well, it was technically a disaster, but an informative disaster. They started with a standard wooden boxcar, the kind railroads used for everything from grain to furniture, and modified it. Ice bunkers at each end of the car, insulated walls using sawdust and wood shavings, a false ceiling to create an airspace, metal racks to hang the beef carcasses so air could circulate around the meat. The theory was sound. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so it sinks. If you put ice at the top of the car, the cold air would fall, push the warm air up, and create a circulation pattern. The melted ice would drain through pipes to the outside, keeping the meat dry. The beef would hang in the middle of the car where the temperature would stay just above freezing. They loaded it up with dressed beef, maybe 30 carcasses, about 18,000 pounds, and sent it east on the Michigan Central Railroad. It arrived in Boston 3 days later, and the meat was, well, it was not great. Not spoiled exactly, but not fresh either. Some discoloration, some surface freezing where beef touched the ice compartment walls. The temperature inside had varied too much. The ice had melted too fast. The drainage hadn't worked properly, and some of the beef had water damage. Swift looked at the results and saw a dozen problems to solve. His investors looked at the results and saw their money disappearing. Because building these cars wasn't cheap. A standard boxcar in 1878 cost maybe $600. Chase's refrigerated design cost nearly $1,400 per car, more than double. And that didn't include the ice you had to load at both ends of the trip, the special loading equipment, the modifications to slaughterhouse facilities to prepare beef for hanging transport. The existing system of shipping live cattle was, well, it worked. It was established. It was predictable. Yes, it was inefficient, but everyone knew how to do it. Everyone made money. Why risk everything on these expensive experimental ice boxes on wheels that didn't even keep the meat fresh yet? Swift's business partners started getting nervous. Some wanted to give up on the whole refrigeration idea and stick with live cattle. But Swift had done the math too many times. He knew the potential was enormous. He knew the system was almost right. It just needed adjustments. So through 1879 and into 1880, Chase kept refining the design. They discovered that the ice bunkers needed better insulation. Multiple layers of dead airspace worked better than just sawdust. They figured out that the ice needed to be crushed or broken into smaller pieces so it packed tighter and melted more evenly. They realized the drainage pipes had to be carefully angled or they'd freeze shut and then melted ice would back up into the car. The air circulation turned out to be the trickiest part. Cold air didn't just magically circulate on its own. They needed baffles and ducts to direct airflow. They experimented with different ceiling heights, different hanging rack positions, different ventilation patterns. Each modification meant building a new prototype car or extensively rebuilding an existing one. And all of this was happening while Swift was still trying to run an actual business, still buying cattle, still slaughtering them, still trying to sell beef in a market that didn't quite trust Chicago meat yet. But by late 1880, Chase's design was starting to work. The key breakthrough was a forced air circulation system, using the temperature differential itself to drive air movement. Cold air from the ice bunkers at the top would flow down through ducts along the car's corners, pass under the hanging beef, then rise back up through the center as it warmed. The beef hung in the coldest part of the airflow. The metal racks were positioned to maximize air contact with every carcass. The insulation was thick enough that ice would last 4 days even in summer heat. Swift loaded up 10 of the new cars in Chicago and sent them to New York. And when they arrived, the beef looked fresh, looked like it had been slaughtered that morning. Red, firm, no discoloration, no off smell. You couldn't tell the difference between Swift's dressed beef and a locally slaughtered steer. That's when the real fight started. Because now Swift wasn't just some guy with a crazy idea. He was a direct threat to thousands of local butchers who'd been slaughtering cattle for decades. He was a threat to the eastern cattle dealers who brought live animals into cities. He was a threat to the economic system that had made a lot of people a lot of money. The New York Butchers Association launched a public campaign against Chicago dressed beef, claiming it was unwholesome, unsafe, old meat being passed off as fresh. They got newspapers to run articles questioning whether beef that had been dead for 3 or 4 days could possibly be as good as locally slaughtered beef. Some butchers refused to sell Chicago beef. Some restaurants were pressured not to buy it. There were rumors, probably started by Swift's competitors, that the refrigerated cars were actually just regular boxcars where the meat had been chemically treated to hide spoilage. And the railroads, they still didn't want to carry refrigerated cars. See, the major rail lines had invested heavily in stock cars, special railroad cars designed to transport live cattle. They'd built stockyard facilities at major terminals where cattle could be unloaded, watered, fed, rested. They had contracts with cattle dealers. They had entire business divisions built around live cattle transport. If refrigerated beef became the standard, all that infrastructure would be worthless. Worse, Swift's dressed beef weighed half what live cattle weighed, so the railroads would earn half as much per animal. They'd lose revenue, lose asset value, and lose their partnerships with the cattle dealers. So when Swift needed railroad capacity for his refrigerated cars, the major lines dragged their feet. They'd quote him high rates, they'd say they didn't have space on freight schedules, they'd route his cars through slow routes with multiple transfers, adding days to the journey and more ice costs. Swift couldn't build a national distribution network without reliable railroad access, and the railroads wouldn't give it to him. He had a working refrigerated car, he had dressed beef that arrived fresh, he had proven the concept, but he couldn't scale it because the infrastructure he needed was controlled by people who wanted him to fail. In early 1881, Swift did something audacious. He couldn't make the railroads cooperate, so he decided to build his own distribution network. He'd ship his refrigerated cars however he could, on any railroad that would carry them, on any schedule he could get, and he'd establish his own rail sales offices in every major city, his own warehouses, his own delivery wagons, his own retail relationships. It would cost a fortune. It would take years. His investors thought he was insane, but Swift had calculated that if he could deliver fresh Chicago beef to eastern cities at prices below what local butchers could match, the customers would come, the quality would win, the economics would work. He just had to survive long enough to prove it.
By 1882, Gustavus Swift was running what might have been the most complicated logistics operation in America, and most people didn't even realize it existed yet. Every day, cattle arrived at the Chicago stockyards from ranches across the Western Plains. Swift's buyers would select animals, pay the ranchers, and drive the cattle to Swift's slaughterhouse on the south side. The slaughterhouse ran 2 shifts, killing and dressing maybe 500 head per day. The beef had to be cooled immediately in chill rooms, just big refrigerated warehouses where sides of beef hung for 12 to 24 hours to bring the internal temperature down. Then the cooled beef was loaded into the refrigerated cars. Each car held about 30 full carcasses, and each carcass had to be carefully hung on the metal racks so air could circulate. The ice bunkers were filled, tons of ice per car, packed around the top and sides. The doors were sealed, and the car was coupled into whatever freight train Swift could convince to carry it. And here's the thing nobody talks about. The ice only lasted 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather cooperated, so every refrigerated car was racing against time from the moment it left Chicago. If the railroad delayed the car, if it sat on a siding waiting for a connection, if it got rerouted, the ice would run out and the beef would spoil. 30 carcasses, 18,000 pounds of beef, $2,000 worth of product, just gone. A total loss. Swift couldn't afford many losses like that, so he needed to know where every car was, every hour of every day. He needed to know if a car was delayed. He needed ice replenishment stations along the routes where cars could be re-iced if necessary. He needed telegraph communication with every city so local managers could prepare for arriving shipments. In the 1880s, this was cutting-edge logistics. The railroads had barely figured out how to track their own cars reliably. Most freight shipments were just sent, and they arrived when they arrived. But Swift couldn't operate that way. Every refrigerated car was a precision instrument on a precise schedule, and if anything went wrong, he lost everything. So Swift set up a whole network. Telegraph operators who'd wire ahead when cars departed, local agents in every major city who'd meet the cars when they arrived, warehouse facilities where the beef could be stored in ice-cooled rooms until it was sold, delivery wagons that would distribute to butcher shops and restaurants. And the railroads kept fighting him. In 1882, the major Eastern railroads formed what was effectively a cartel agreement. They would not carry Swift's refrigerated cars on their primary fast freight schedules. They'd carry them if they absolutely had to, but only on slow routes, only when space was available, and at the highest possible rates. Their reasoning was simple. Live cattle shipping generated more revenue. The cattle dealers who shipped live animals were big customers. Why risk those relationships to help Swift? Swift tried negotiating. He offered railroads guaranteed minimum shipments if they'd give him reliable, fast service. They said no. He offered premium rates for priority routing. They said no again. He tried going to smaller regional railroads who might be more flexible. Some of them said yes, but their routes didn't reach all the cities Swift needed. So Swift made another audacious decision. He'd build his own refrigerated cars, lease them to the railroads under terms that required fast freight service, and if the railroads still wouldn't cooperate, he'd sue them under interstate commerce laws. In 1883, Swift established the Swift Refrigerator line, technically an independent company, though Swift owned it, and started building refrigerated cars to his exact specifications. By 1884, Swift had more than 200 refrigerated cars, all painted with the Swift Refrigerator line logo, all equipped with the latest Chase design improvements. The railroads still didn't want to carry them, but now Swift had leverage. He could point to contracts. He could document when railroads violated their common carrier obligations. He could threaten legal action. And slowly, grudgingly, the railroads started cooperating. Not because they wanted to, but because Swift was becoming too big to ignore, and the threat of legal trouble wasn't worth the revenue they'd lose from cattle dealers. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Swift was dealing with competition from other meatpackers who'd been watching Swift's refrigerator car experiment. Philip Armour ran the largest meatpacking operation in Chicago, and he'd been skeptical of refrigerated transport. But by 1883, seeing Swift's success, Armour started building his own refrigerated cars. So did Nelson Morris, and Gustavus Swift and Company suddenly had competitors who'd learned from Swift's mistakes and could undercut his prices. The competition was actually good for Swift. Sounds weird, but here's why. Every time another meatpacker started shipping dressed beef, it legitimized the whole concept. It made refrigerated beef more normal, more accepted. The Eastern butchers couldn't claim Swift's beef was suspiciously cheap or suspiciously preserved if Armour's beef and Morris's beef arrived the same way at similar prices. The whole industry was shifting, and Swift, who'd taken all the early risks, who'd built the distribution network, who'd fought the railroads and the butchers and the skeptics, was positioned to benefit most. But running this operation required incredible capital. Building refrigerated cars, establishing warehouses in every major city, paying for ice, paying for telegraph communications, buying cattle faster than you could sell beef because slaughter operations needed steady volume to be efficient. Swift was constantly short on cash. His company was growing explosively. Sales went from maybe $2 million in 1880 to over $10 million by 1885. But growth takes capital. He borrowed from banks, he brought in partners and investors, he plowed every dollar of profit back into more cars, more warehouses, more capacity. And the whole time he was refining the system. Better insulation materials, more efficient ice packing, improved drainage systems, modified hanging racks that could fit more beef per car. Every small improvement mattered because Swift was operating on thin margins. If he could get one more carcass per car, that's 3% more revenue for the same shipping cost. If better insulation meant ice lasted an extra day, he could reach more distant cities. By 1885, the Chase refrigerator car design had evolved into something genuinely sophisticated. The ice bunkers were lined with multiple layers of insulation, wood shavings, then airspace, then more wood shavings, then interior metal panels. The drainage system used gravity flow with check valves that prevented warm outside air from entering the car. The hanging racks were precisely positioned to maximize cold air circulation around each carcass. The whole car maintained temperatures between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 full days. This wasn't just a box with ice anymore. It was precision refrigeration engineering, designed to survive the rough handling of railroad operations while maintaining exact temperature control over thousands of miles. And it worked. Swift was shipping dressed beef to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, even Atlanta and New Orleans. Cities that had always gotten their beef from local slaughterhouses were now eating Chicago beef, and most consumers couldn't tell the difference. Some claimed it was actually better, more consistent quality, better aging, less variation between cuts. The local butchers were losing the fight. They'd tried public campaigns, tried lobbying, tried boycotts, but economics won. Swift could sell beef for 1 to 2 cents per pound less than local butchers, and that mattered to restaurants, hotels, and regular families. The savings added up. By 1886, Swift & Company was slaughtering over 100,000 cattle a year in Chicago and shipping the beef nationwide. They employed thousands of workers in Chicago alone. They operated their own stockyard facilities, their own slaughterhouses, their own refrigerated car fleet, their own distribution network in 30 cities. And Gustavus Swift, who'd started with $19 and a borrowed heifer at age 14, who'd built a business on the simple observation that shipping live cattle was inefficient, had revolutionized American food distribution. But the story wasn't over, because the refrigerated car didn't just change beef, it changed everything.
Here's what happened next, and it's maybe more important than the refrigerated beef car itself. Once you had a car that could keep beef cold for 5 days while rolling across the country, you could keep anything cold for 5 days while rolling across the country. By 1888, Swift and his competitors were shipping more than just beef: pork, lamb, poultry, butter, eggs, cheese, fresh vegetables, fruit. Anything that needed refrigeration could now be transported from wherever it was produced to wherever people wanted to buy it. And this changed American agriculture completely. Before refrigerated transport, farmers grew food near cities because food spoiled quickly. Boston got vegetables from farms around Boston. New York got milk from dairies in upstate New York. Chicago got fruit from Michigan orchards. Every city was fed by its immediate surrounding region, and that limited both variety and supply. After refrigerated transport, geography stopped mattering as much. California oranges could reach New York, Florida strawberries could reach Chicago in February, Georgia peaches could reach Boston, dairy farmers in Wisconsin could ship cheese and butter to anywhere in the country. The refrigerated railroad car, this innovation that Swift had developed specifically to solve the beef shipping problem, basically created the modern national food system. It made seasonal foods available year-round. It made regional specialties available nationally. It lowered food prices in cities and raised farm incomes in rural areas. And it happened fast. By 1890, there were over 3,000 refrigerated cars in operation nationwide, carrying $50 million worth of perishable products annually. By 1900, that number had grown to 70,000 refrigerated cars and over $400 million in transported goods. The industry was growing exponentially. Swift Company grew with it. They'd started with just beef, but by 1990 they were diversifying. Pork products, bacon, ham, sausage, canned meat, leather from cattle hides, soap and glue from animal fats and bones, pharmaceuticals from animal organs. They weren't just a meat-packing company anymore. They were an integrated processing operation that used every part of every animal. This vertical integration was another Swift innovation. Before Swift, slaughterhouses were just slaughterhouses. They killed animals, sold the meat, and threw away the rest. Swift realized that bones could be ground into fertilizer, blood could be processed into industrial products, hides could be tanned into leather, organs could be sold to pharmaceutical companies. Nothing was waste if you could find a use for it. By 1895, Swift & Company were operating plants in Chicago, Kansas City, Omaha, St. Louis, St. Paul, and Fort Worth. They employed over 25,000 workers. They processed over 2 million cattle, 2 million hogs, and hundreds of thousands of sheep annually. They had their own stockyards, their own railroads, their own distribution network in over 200 cities. And Gustavus Swift still came to work every day, still watched operations, still looked for inefficiencies. The company's stories about Swift are kind of amazing, actually. He'd walk through the packing plants and notice scraps of meat on the floor, and he'd ask why that meat wasn't being saved. Workers would explain that it was just trimmings, not worth the effort to process. Swift would calculate how much meat was being lost per day, multiply it by 365 days, and show them that millions of pounds of sellable product were literally being thrown away. He'd watch the slaughter process and notice that workers were taking an extra step that wasn't necessary, and he'd redesign the workflow to eliminate that step. Over thousands of repetitions per day, eliminating one unnecessary motion saved hours of labor and reduced costs. He'd review shipping schedules and notice that refrigerated cars were sitting empty on return trips from eastern cities back to Chicago, and he'd figure out products that eastern cities produced that needed refrigerated transport back west so the cars could earn revenue in both directions. This obsessive attention to efficiency made Swift & Company the most profitable meatpacking operation in America, and it drove their competitors crazy because they couldn't quite match Swift's cost advantages. They had similar facilities, similar refrigerated cars, similar distribution networks, but somehow Swift's operations were just a little bit more efficient, a little bit more integrated, a little bit cheaper. The competition between Swift, Armour, Morris, and the other Chicago meatpackers became legendary. They'd undercut each other's prices by fractions of a cent per pound. They'd raid each other's workers. They'd compete for the best locations for distribution warehouses. They'd try to secure exclusive contracts with railroads or with large restaurant chains. But the competition also drove innovation. Faster slaughter processes, better refrigeration technology, more efficient butchering methods, improved packaging that kept meat fresh longer. Every competitive advantage one company gained, the others had to match or exceed. By 1900, the big four meatpackers, Swift, Armour, Morris, and Hammond, controlled over 85% of American meat production. They'd eliminated most local slaughterhouses through sheer economies of scale. They'd standardized meat processing to the point where beef from any of the big four plants was essentially identical in quality and price. And they'd done it all using the refrigerated railroad car, this innovation that Gustavus Swift and Andrew Chase had developed 20 years earlier to solve one specific problem: how to ship dead meat without it spoiling. The impact on American life was enormous. Meat prices in eastern cities dropped by 30 to 40% between 1880 and 1900. Beef consumption per capita doubled. Working-class families who could only afford meat once or twice a week were now eating it daily. Restaurants could serve steak cheaply enough that regular people could afford it. The Chicago meatpackers became symbols of American industrial capitalism, both the good and the bad. The good, they'd made protein affordable for millions of people. They'd built enormous businesses that employed tens of thousands of workers. They'd pioneered innovations in refrigeration and logistics that changed multiple industries. The bad, they operated brutal workplaces where injuries were common and workers were treated as disposable. They engaged in anti-competitive practices that drove small businesses out of existence. They wielded enormous political influence to prevent regulation of their industry. Upton Sinclair's novel, 1906, The Jungle, exposed the horrific conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants, leading to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act.
The image of the efficient, modern, sanitary refrigerated meat system ran headlong into the reality of dangerous, unsanitary working conditions and questionable processing standards. But none of that changes the fundamental innovation. The refrigerated railroad car worked. It transformed American food distribution from a local, seasonal, limited system to a national, year-round, abundant system. It demonstrated that perishable products could be transported long distances if you understood the thermodynamics and engineering well enough. And it proved something Swift had believed from the beginning. The math matters. If you can reduce waste, increase efficiency, and lower costs, you can change entire industries. You just have to be willing to fight the people who benefit from the old, inefficient system long enough to prove the new system works better.
Gustavus Swift died in 1903 at the age of 63, and by that time, he'd built one of the largest corporations in America. Swift and Company employed over 30,000 people. They processed nearly 4 million animals annually. They operated facilities in a dozen cities. They had their own refrigerated car fleet of over 7,000 cars. The company's annual revenue exceeded $160 million, close to $5 billion in modern dollars. But Swift himself remained kind of a regular guy, actually. He still lived modestly, he still came to work every day, he still walked through the plants looking for inefficiencies. There's this story that near the end of his life, a visitor to his office mentioned that Swift must be proud of building such an enormous company, and Swift supposedly said something like, "I just wanted to ship beef without it spoiling. Everything else sort of followed from that." Which is maybe the most important lesson in the whole story. Swift didn't set out to revolutionize American agriculture or create a national food distribution system or change how cities got fed. He just saw one specific problem, the inefficiency of shipping live cattle when you only wanted to sell the meat, and he focused on solving that problem. The refrigerated railroad car was the solution. Everything else cascaded from that one innovation. After Swift's death, Swift and Company continued growing. They expanded internationally. They developed more processed food products. They pioneered new preservation methods. By the 1920s, they were one of the largest food companies in the world. But the core of the business was still that refrigerated transport system that Swift and Chase had developed 40 years earlier. The technology kept evolving too. Mechanical refrigeration started replacing ice-based systems in the 19-teens. Compressed gas refrigerants, electric cooling units, thermostat controls. All of this made refrigerated transport more reliable and more efficient. By the 1930s, refrigerated trucks were competing with refrigerated railroad cars for short-distance shipping. By the 1950s, refrigerated containers that could be loaded onto ships, trains, or trucks were making global food transport practical. But the fundamental principle never changed. If you maintain precise temperature control, you can transport perishable products anywhere. Swift proved that principle in 1880, and it's still the basis of the entire global food system today. Modern refrigerated shipping is obviously far more sophisticated than Swift's ice bunker railroad cars. We have GPS tracking, real-time temperature monitoring, automated climate control systems, modified atmosphere packaging that extends shelf life even further. A refrigerated container ship today can carry 5,000 containers of frozen food from Asia to America, maintaining precise temperatures for weeks. But it's all the same basic idea. Isolate the product from external temperature, remove heat continuously, maintain cold air circulation, monitor, and adjust. Swift and Chase figured out those principles in the 1870s and 1880s through trial and error, building car after car, testing design after design, losing money on failed attempts until they finally got it right. The broader impact of refrigerated transport goes beyond just food, too. The medical field, for instance, uses refrigerated shipping for vaccines, organs, blood supplies, pharmaceuticals. The chemical industry ships temperature-sensitive materials. The electronics industry uses climate-controlled transport for sensitive components. All of this depends on the same refrigeration principles that Swift applied to shipping beef. So when you buy strawberries in winter, or eat beef that was processed 1,000 miles away, or grab a cold drink from a convenience store, There's a direct line connecting that convenience back to Gustavus Swift standing in a Chicago slaughterhouse in 1875, doing math in his head and realizing that the existing system didn't make sense. The opposition he faced, from railroads who didn't want to change their business model, from local butchers who didn't want competition, from investors who thought the risk was too high, that opposition is pretty much standard for any major innovation. The existing system always has defenders, because people benefit from how things currently work. Changing the system threatens those benefits. But if the new system is actually better, more efficient, cheaper, higher quality, it eventually wins. Not quickly, not easily, but eventually. Swift spent years fighting the railroads and the butchers and the skeptics. He lost money for years before refrigerated beef became profitable. But the math was on his side, and math doesn't lie. Shipping dressed beef was cheaper and better than shipping live cattle, and once he could prove that consistently, the market shifted. Today, we barely think about where our food comes from or how it reaches us. We expect year-round availability of everything. We expect consistent quality. We expect reasonable prices. All of that is possible because of the national and global food distribution systems that depend on refrigerated transport. And refrigerated transport exists because Gustavus Swift looked at a trainload of cattle heading east in 1875 and thought, there has to be a better way. That's the nature of innovation, really. Most revolutionary changes start with someone noticing an inefficiency, or questioning an assumption, or asking why things have to work the way they've always worked. The answers aren't always obvious, the solutions aren't always easy, the opposition isn't always rational. But sometimes, if you're stubborn enough, and smart enough, and lucky enough to survive long enough to prove your idea works, you change the world. Swift changed how America eats. That's not a small thing.